Citizens are fleeing Sichuan, China after a suspected chemical plant gas leak caused the entire district to be covered by smoke. Colleges and universities in the United States have received warnings from the State Department to divest their endowments from Chinese companies. This is as ties between U.S. universities and China are being exposed. And also, the Chinese regime may have played a hand in the mass protests and riots that have been sweeping across the United States. We'll be taking an in-depth look at this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. In a district of Sichuan Province, there was a suspected gas leak from a chemical plant, and the entire district was covered by smoke for 3 days. Many citizens fled the city after smelling a strong odor. On August 21st, local resident Mr. Zheng told NTD there was a thick, pungent mist in the air in Wutongqiao District for 3 consecutive days. On the morning of the 20th, rumors spread that there could be an explosion in the chemical plant in that district, which caused the frightened residents to flee the area. Now, this will be interpreted in context of the recent explosion in Belarus and also the 2015 chemical plant explosion in China's port of Tianjin. So for Chinese people, of course, it's only natural they would be concerned about a chemical leak and being able to smell the toxins in the air, because again, they would interpret it in these 2 chemical explosions. And after CCP leader Xi Jinping gave public remarks against wasting food and criticized the mukbang virtual eating videos from China's vloggers, a mukbang video channel called, quote, "Nothing to Eat" has gone viral in China, and it's of a vlogger pretending to eat nothing. Now, it's important to note that while Chinese authorities and Chinese state media have said there's no such thing as a food crisis in China, when Xi Jinping, the head of the CCP, came out and talked about the issue of, say, wasting food, one of his direct statements was on food security. And so there's a discrepancy between Xi Jinping's actual statement and what Chinese state media and different authorities are telling the Chinese people. It seems they're trying to walk back concerns when it comes to food security in China. Now, in the United States, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon has pleaded not guilty to charges that he defrauded donors in the crowd-funded Build the Wall campaign. And he's been released on bail.
This entire fiasco is to stop people who want to build the wall.
Now, Bannon is being charged alongside 3 other individuals. He's being accused of receiving $1 million in the $25 million project that had told donors that all money would be used for construction. And with the upcoming 2020 U.S. presidential elections, Trump announced that he intends to send law enforcement officers and potentially even U.S. attorneys to help monitor polling stations to prevent voter fraud. Voter fraud, especially in relation to possible mail-in ballots, has become a topic of concern in the upcoming 2020 presidential elections.
You're not going to be able to know the end of this election, in my opinion, for weeks, months, maybe never, maybe years, but maybe never. They'll send in the ballot and then they'll vote. What are the chances that some states so efficiently run? Oh, gee, you can't vote. We just got your ballot last night at 7 o'clock. I mean, think of how ridiculous it is, right? Common sense. I say this for the media. This will be the greatest catastrophe, one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of our country. That's how serious it is. And they also think I'm trying to steal an election. Just the opposite. I want the fair results of an election.
And colleges and universities in the United States, meanwhile, have received warnings from the U.S. State Department to divest from Chinese holdings in their endowments. Keith Krach, the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, wrote in a letter that boards of U.S. university endowments, quote, would be prudent to divest. He says these are from firms or stocks tied to the Chinese Communist Party, and the, quote, likely outcome that these firms may be delisted from U.S. exchanges by the end of next year. He also asked the universities to, quote, strongly consider publicly disclosing to your campus communities immediately all the Chinese companies that the university endowments are invested in. Now, this exposes even further ties between U.S. universities and China. This is at a time when the Department of Education is investigating the CCP's subversion of universities. And aside from showing the deeper ties between U.S. universities and China, this also sends a message to investors with holdings in Chinese companies, and it could have major implications for Chinese listings, Because if you're going to invest and you hear that maybe by the end of next year, Chinese companies could get delisted from the US stock exchanges, what does that mean if you have money in them? Many of them very likely are going to pull their money out or will stop investing in them altogether. We'll have to see how this develops. And related to this, a class action lawsuit has been filed in the United States against China's tech company Baidu, which is kind of like the Google of China, after it was exposed that its iQIYI broadcasting platform, known as the Netflix of China, which is also kind of like a YouTube of China, is under investigation by the U.S. Securities Regulatory Commission for allegedly falsifying its financial data. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of people who acquired securities of Baidu, and it seeks damages for investors. Again, the implications of this go beyond Baidu. This is going to reflect on other Chinese companies overall and the risks involved for investors in these companies. We've seen again and again that Chinese companies are being dishonest with their shareholders in order to increase profits. We saw this, for example, with Luckin Coffee. Now we're seeing it with Baidu, and there have been others as well. Now this goes hand in hand with the U.S. sanctions that are holding Chinese companies accountable for abuses in China, such as when it comes to the Muslim Uyghurs or when it comes to Hong Kong. And at the same time, on top of that, the U.S. is pushing to hold Chinese companies accountable to the same auditing standards as U.S. companies if they're going to be listed on the U.S. stock exchange. And this means very likely, in addition to all these issues, these companies are going to be exposed on many different levels potentially, which means, again, what does it mean for investors who have money in these companies? What does it mean for potential investors going forward? And if the U.S. State Department is warning universities again that by the end of next year these companies could be delisted, what message does that send to investors? And in North Korea, meanwhile, it is expelling retired military officers to save food. This is bringing an additional focus to an emerging food crisis in the country, and also in light of that, to the looming food crisis in China, allegedly. Now, North Korean authorities issued a deportation order to increase the service period of Pyongyang retired officers from 30 to 35 years. This forces them to leave the city in order to reduce the number of residents in the capital. And this takes place again, also amid concerns that China may face food shortages. Now, North Korea, being a neighboring country to China, also receives a lot of aid from China. And so if it's facing crisis in these different areas, it very likely means that it's not getting that aid from China, which means China very likely is trying to hold on to these stores for itself. This again is a hint of the possible crisis that China may be facing. And in the Philippines, where the local government has recently signaled it will not stand up to the CCP's incursions in the South China Sea, its government has now lodged a diplomatic protest over allegations that the CCP illegally confiscated equipment from Filipino fishermen in a disputed lagoon that the Chinese regime claims ownership over. Now, this is somewhat of a bizarre move by the Chinese Communist Party. It's not very smart of them, at least on the surface. Philippine President Duterte said that he will not push back on the CCP in the South China Sea. In the broader context of this is taking place as different countries surrounding China are becoming less tolerant of its incursions, territorial disputes, and threats. Again, Vietnam, India, Japan, Australia, so on. Many of these countries are pushing back much harder against the CCP. Yet rather than take reduced pressure from one of these countries, the Philippines, the Chinese regime is instead coaxing the Philippines to take a stand against it. It's almost as if the CCP is pushing the Philippines to react, after Duterte, the president of the country, said he would not do so. And meanwhile, in Israel, it's looking to establish diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates and is expecting other Arab countries to follow. And as it's moving forward with this, terrorist groups in the Gaza Strip have fired 12 rockets into Israel. 9 of the rockets were intercepted, and Israel responded with 3 airstrikes on targets that were linked to the rulers of the terrorist organization Hamas. Now for the broader stories for today. First off, the Chinese regime may have played a hand in the mass protests and riots that have been sweeping across the United States. It allegedly identified and set guidance to people who were aligned with Black Lives Matter and the far-left radical organization Antifa. This is according to a recent article by Radio Free Asia, which also noted the CCP's actions played a role in the U.S. ordering the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston. According to the story, the CCP had sent soldiers from the 2nd Department of its General Staff Department to the Chinese consulate in Houston. They were equipped with fake IDs as well. From there, they used data from a large video platform to identify people whose interests suggested that they may participate in protests around Black Lives Matter and Antifa. It then created and sent them customized videos on how to organize riots and how to spread their messages. The story does not name the companies that were involved in the operations. Now, this is interesting from a few different angles. When it comes to the soldiers the CCP sent to the consulate, the General Staff Department is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military. The second department, the spy branch, operates alongside its signals intelligence branch, known for its military hackers, which is the third department. You might remember those individuals indicted during the Obama administration with Unit 61398. Those were third department. Now, why were spies from the war-fighting branch of China's military sent to the United States to stir up unrest? It's also interesting that soldiers from the CCP's military spy agency were sent to the United States with fake IDs. This may relate to the recent announcement from U.S. Customs and Border Protection that it seized close to 20,000 fake IDs in Chicago and said the majority of them had arrived from China. When it comes to the CCP getting involved in the protests and riots in the United States, it's also interesting to note that Russia was found to have done something very similar ahead of the U.S. elections in 2016. And now that we move on to the 2020 elections, this is a big deal in that context. This is among the few points that were used as evidence of Russia meddling in the elections. The Russian trolls were exposed for buying advertisements in different social media platforms that promoted civil unrest. And as Slate noted at the time, the findings emerged that, quote, Russian trolls were obsessed with Black Lives Matter. Part of this ties to long-running operations around ideological subversion. These were Soviet-era methods of demoralizing and destabilizing a country. Part of the idea was to encourage and to accelerate what would have otherwise been grassroots unrest. The CCP appears to have taken this even further, however, by deploying soldiers on American soil, then using big data technology to identify and target Americans directly with their guidelines on how to organize riots. In Shanghai, meanwhile, the personal information of more than 1.9 million Communist Party members was leaked, and the Epoch Times received Excel files containing details on CCP members in Shanghai's municipal government institutions and businesses. The leaked records contain names, birthplace, ID numbers, home addresses, and communication information of the Shanghai members of the Chinese Communist Party, and Epoch Times was able to confirm the legitimacy of these documents. The leaked list of party members began to circulate online after the United States announced potential visa restrictions on CCP members and their families. While the documents were only leaked recently, it does appear they come from as early as July 2016. Now, why does this matter? This adds to fear among CCP officials, both of the discussions around travel restrictions on CCP members and of the possibility that they could be hit by U.S. sanctions for carrying out abusive orders from the Chinese Communist Party. In other news, the CCP is launching a new program to create science fiction films as forms of propaganda. The announcement was made on August 7 by the China Film Administration and the China Association for Science and Technology in a document titled, quote, Several Opinions on Promoting the Development of Science Fiction Films. The document proposes they create sci-fi films as a tool for the CCP to create big-budget films and to build China into a country with, quote, film power. The document outlines 10 proposed measures to create the technology and systems for making these films. And it doesn't hold back on stating its direct intentions. An overview of the plan says it, quote, emphasized that it is necessary to thoroughly study and implement Xi Jinping's new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics and the spirit of General Secretary Xi Jinping's important instructions on film work. Now, why does this matter? The Chinese Communist Party has for years been putting in heavy effort to buy influence in Hollywood. Included among the many deals it has made in Hollywood was Dalian Wanda Group's purchase of Legendary Entertainment and AMC Entertainment Holdings, which operates AMC theaters. At the time of the AMC purchase in 2012, former CCP leader Hu Jintao claimed that, quote, international hostile forces are stepping up their strategic attempts to westernize and divide our country. And he claimed that ideology and culture were targets for their, quote, long-term infiltration. He then went on to say that democracy movements are caused by, quote, spiritual pollution and, quote, bourgeois liberalization. And in that light, he called on the CCP to take, quote, effective countermeasures. And the CCP has since gained heavy influence over the global film industry. PEN America issued a report recently on how China censors Hollywood films. It notes that the CCP has used money to expand its programs of censorship abroad. It states that decision makers in Hollywood and other professionals in the industry are increasingly making decisions about their films, including on content, casting, plot, dialogue, and even settings, quote, based on an effort to avoid antagonizing Chinese officials who control whether their films gain access to the booming Chinese market. American film studios are competing with each other to gain access to the Chinese markets because the CCP limits the number of films allowed into China, and this means they are bowing to the CCP's demands. The report notes that studios are, quote, making difficult and troubling compromises on free expression. And it says this includes changing the content of films, practicing self-censorship, showing altered versions of the films in China, and, quote, in some instances, directly inviting Chinese government censors onto their film sets to advise them on how to avoid tripping the censors' wires. And for the CCP, the control over movies has strategic value. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission noted in 2015 that, quote, China views film as a component of social control. This is even outlined in military writings in China under the concept of culture warfare. The infamous unrestricted warfare doctrine from 1999, which is regarded as a blueprint for the CCP's programs on unconventional warfare, describes cultural warfare as a program for, quote, leading cultural trends along in order to assimilate those with different views. This Chinese military document says that, quote, warfare is no longer an activity confined only to the military sphere. And it says that the course and outcome of war can be decided by factors that include politics, economy, and culture. Meanwhile, the recent protests in Belarus and Eastern Europe are threatening to undo the CCP's local efforts through the Belt and Road Initiative. The country's president, Alexander Lukashenko, known as the last dictator of Europe, won his 6th consecutive term in office on August 9th, and accusations of election fraud have led to large-scale protests against his regime. According to South China Morning Post, by 2019, the CCP had invested more than $450 million in Belarus. And after Lukashenko won re-election, he was congratulated directly by CCP leader Xi Jinping. These protests against Lukashenko aren't showing signs of stopping either. And as Nikkei reports, the situation has created a, quote, potential no-win situation for China, which has sought to make Belarus an integral part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It notes that if Lukashenko falls, the CCP will lose one of its main partners. And if he stays in power, there will likely be a stronger backlash from the West that could, quote, overturn China's efforts to make Belarus its entrance to Europe. As things currently stand, Lukashenko ordered police to put down the protests and has even sent a call to Russia for help in these efforts.
И надо связаться с Путиным, президентом России, чтобы я мог с ним переговорить сейчас. Потому что это уже угроза не только Беларуси.
The opposition in that country, meanwhile, has established a council and is gaining support from members of the government. Now, when it comes to the bigger picture of this situation is almost identical to what took place in Venezuela, where the CCP and Russia both had strong investments and connections with the Maduro regime, and where the CCP also had poured a lot of money into its infrastructure. The intervention in Venezuela by the CCP and by Russia is seen as one of the main reasons why the Maduro regime is still in power, and they were also threatening the United States, warning it to not get involved there either. And now something very similar is taking place in Europe and Belarus. Now the situation there is somewhat different. Again, this is Europe, not Latin America. The CCP has less influence in Europe than it does in Latin America. And so it's unclear whether the CCP could replicate what it did in Venezuela in Belarus. We'll have to see how this develops, and we'll be covering it as it goes forward. Meanwhile, after the recent large explosion in Lebanon, Chinese state media published an article declaring the close ties between Lebanon and the CCP. The article states that Lebanon is an important hub on the Silk Road, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, and that China has maintained it as one of its strongest trading partners, totaling over $2 billion a year. After the statement was published, however, it drew attention to the ties between Lebanon and China. This led to Hong Kong media publishing a story on August 4th for refuting rumors, and that said the port explosion in Lebanon had nothing to do with China. The article stated, quote, China in fact only ranks 12th in the world with an export volume of 202,000 tons of ammonium nitrate. And it claims the critics who believe the CCP was involved in the explosion at that port are, quote, obviously very unfamiliar with the international trade information of ammonium nitrate and the actual production of ammonium nitrate in mainland China. The debate around this didn't end with that story, however. Chinese state media ran a story on August 10th stating the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology gave orders to, quote, strictly check and strengthen raw material management of civil explosives such as ammonium nitrate. This was followed by another state-run news piece on August 14th that stated the CCP's Work Safety Committee of the State Council conducted unannounced visits to chemical production and storage. Now, given the situation, it's unclear whether China had anything to do with the explosion in Lebanon. But the CCP's open denial of its involvement, followed by state-run media reports around the chemicals allegedly involved in the explosion, do hint that it's something worth paying attention to. With that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.